Daniel Saxon was born on the move. His parents were Joseph Saxon, a Methodist Fonter circuit minister, and Annabelle Westenberg Saxon, herself a daughter of a Swedish Lutheran pastor in Delaware, who had been defrocked and excommunicated for the embracing of the Swedenborgian movement. Danielle's early memories were consistently of changing places and people, many of them blurring into inaccurate opposite of composed settings. He had no siblings and no lasting friendships. Most of the formative years were spent at the frontier revival camps or at Indian missions. Annabelle died when Daniel was an infant, and he only had the vaguest, possibly most fabricated memories of her. Joseph and his son were met with a detachment from the United States soldiers while riding the circuit to the Ontario, Ohio territory during the Northwest Indian War. Joseph Saxon and himself had been a colonel for the Continental Army, but was now a avowed pacifist. This encounter was Daniel's first impression of what soldiers looked like. Their stylish uniforms immediately attracted him into military life. His father was determined that Daniel should be a minister like him, and after inviting soldiers to one of his revival meetings, they quickly parted ways. Joseph died when Daniel was 16. Against his father's wishes, he moved to Cambridge and enrolled in Harvard to study not the ministry, but secular humanities. He quickly became the admirer of Voltaire, Kant, and Locke. Religion, as much as cannot be further from his admonitions. When war broke out again, with Britain all over Indian territories in 1812, he left university to join New York Militia, where he was commissioned the rank of captain, just 20 years old. He was given a command of a company of 60 men and ordered to march to Lake Ontario, where to establish a fort to prevent British ambitious incursions. The land Captain Saxon chose for his new fort to be poorly suited for the purpose. He selected low clearings surrounded by the woods about a quarter from a mile from the lake. The ground was permanently moist and rocky, and the clearing itself was barely suspicious to hold enough to a small post. Mosquitoes were a terror. Nevertheless, they managed to build something from what dry wood they could find, a chest-high ring wall, and some crude earthworks. Saxon also ordered the construction of the shore watchtower, which barely cleared the surrounding trees to overlook the lake. No proper barracks were built, only the large wooden dwelling that the man would sleep under. The fort's clear one advantage was that nobody would ever guessed it was there. Captain Saxon named the post Fort Kent. His mission was to watch for British patrols, but there was never really any sign of the Redcoats. He turned his focus to the matter of shoring up his garrison's provisions for the upcoming winter, setting out to forage parties and excising supplies from local farms. They eventually planted a vegetable garden. Daniel took to meditating in the evening down by the lake. Sometimes he would see a warship, but never really land forces. Now and again he would drill on men, but that quickly became tiresome. Soon he felt his assignment was pointless. The first real excitement came not from the enemy, but from among his own men. A certain Private Sowell had gotten into the altercation with one of the Corporal Dunning. The private had been punching the corporal in the nose, killing him. Saxon held a drumhead at his command tent by the lookout tower. There was only one corrected position. Private Schwally had to die, but the man bubbled and sobbed that he had never intended for the corporal to be killed. He didn't plead for his life, only that he was sorry. It was a pathetic display, but one that weighed heavily on Saxon's mind. The prisoner was house-tent within the fort and the extra selection of the fence was to put up the squealer to him from the rest of the garrison. The 2 man and guarded them at all times, and he was not to speak to the other man. Sawill's only request was a Bible. His execution was delayed a few days for a supply party to find one. The best they could manage was an old hempfenel found by a nearby farm. He was shot at the shore of the lake. His executioners were drawn pics and buried right there. His last words had merely been repeat that he was sorry. The dead corporal had been buried under that same strip. It wasn't really the proper that they should intended so close together, but it was the only available space. Captain Saxon had given funeral rites for Dunning, and now was the same for Sawill. He didn't even believe in God at this point. He was able to perform the memory based on watching his father do it so many times, not even having to use the hyphenol at this had been procured. That night Saxon had a dark dream. He dreamt of people falling dead, their bodies flowing out onto the ground, and then being swallowed up by the earth. Winter came without the enemy ever rearing his head. Daniel didn't know much of what was happening outside the forested clearing where his tiny fort lay, but he had heard from the commander from the nearest other garrison that follows the focus of the war that had westward. With fighting season over, most of the men suffered to return home for Christmas, though one perished of pneumonia and was buried at the same makeshift graveyard on the lake. Daniel was almost alone, with just a single handful of men who elected to stay at Fort Kent. They managed to acquire a half-lit keg of beer and a single bottle of wine for Christmas celebration of their own. They sang around the fire at the center until the fort, nearly till morning. It was then time to muster into spring. Some of the men did not report back, and there was some few new faces. Despite not having complete complement of troops, Daniel received orders from abandoned Fort Kent and marched west to east towards the front of the Lake Erie. He was to join the company of regulars where their new fort was being built. They looked at what supplies they could carry and buried the rest. There was no time to demolish the fort, as his orders were to depart immediately. It was then on his way to his new post that Saxon had found his first engagement. In the early evening, forward his patrol, consisting of 6 men, stumbled upon one of the British irregulars in Aspen Grove. Fire was exchanged, and the new main New York force pushed in. The British retreated, melting into encroaching darkness. 2 enemies had been killed. One was captured, but let go as they did not have any time to transport a prisoner. Saxon's company had lost 1 man, and 1 had been wounded. They hastily buried the 3 dead man, while a party was detached to find the spot in the camp for the night. They recommend a low-lying pine grove, where it would be much difficult for potential enemy reinforcements to find them. The needle and the stick laid in ground with bloody uncomfortable, but there were any intruders would have a hard time approaching with it without being heard. It rained that night, which made a further confrontation even more unlikely. Daniel had a reputation of his dream before, people dying and bleeding out on the ground and swallowed up in a giant pit. There was an additional detail. Everything was on fire, and smoke blanketed the dark sky. Having slept for a few hours, they decamped just before dawn. Saxon diverted his course somewhat, but his next destination remained the same, a frontier town en route to the site of the new fort. There would only commend the wounded militant man to the care to the townspeople, rest to resupply. When they arrived, Daniel realized that he had been there before. The town was one of the many that he had to be with his father. In fact, the tiny local church had started as one of Joseph Saxon's missions. The company was larger than the population of the town itself. Several of the local families taken after Joseph's pacifism and refused to the house of the militant man. Daniel considered putting down the town under effective martial law, but without the town being close to the enemy, he decided it was best to be a good neighbor. Those who could not find housing camped outside in a farmer's field. The local minister himself was in town, barely in order to Saxon. He had been an Episcopalian reactor in Boston before joining the Methodist movement. The two talked in the small town of Tavern, but about their different life experiences. When the minister asked the captain if he believed in God, Daniel lied and he said no, but only the general sense. I know that the Indians believe in Great Spirit who created everything. Likewise, the Jews and Mohammedans worships essentially the same God. Jefferson believes in divine providence. I reckon that's what I believe in. I don't comprehend to need to the church to synagogue, though. The minister merely nodded. Daniel wanted to ask if he himself believed in God. As his face left him unsure, their conversation ended with the minister inviting Daniel to service the next day, and him declining. Some of his men attended, and it was when it was finished, they formed up again and the leg of their next journey. Major Thomas Greenwald, officer in fort currently under construction, had been waiting over a fortnight for his expected reinforcements. Neither side of the war had gained yet a naval hegemony over Lake Erie, and the fort was being built in a fluid territory. If the fort was discovered, then it would be 100 British soldiers or Confederate warriors to take it. He gazed over the lakes, not a vessel in sight, but that meant nothing. Greenwald privately intended to surrender or abandon the fort if the British won the unexpected upcoming naval showdown. Regardless of his orders, his quartermaster ran up the hill when he was perched, informing him that somebody was approaching the fort by horse. The major could see him from there, clearly an experienced rider, bolting up the path like a drunk lunatic. The man said he was from the military company that was supposed to reinforce the fort. They had been ambushed by Indians and annihilated. The captain left for dead. He claimed to be the last survivor, though. The others would later be found. Saxon's company have been effectively wiped out. Greenwald cussed, not only that his reinforcements not arrived at all, but there were Indians about, bodies recover out there. He wanted to literally shoot on the messenger. Barely able to contain himself, he sent as many men as he would afford to the scene of massacre. They brought back as many bodies as they found, but Captain Sexton's was not among them. Late October 1814, Colonel Peter Silver had just fought there were 3 wars against the British, and younger officer of the Revolution, and then in the Northwest Indian War. Now he commanded the battalion of Rangers in his latest frontier war. With the war drawing to a close, he expected to retire soon, maybe buy a plantation or a tidewater, or live out his days as a merchant or a statesman in New England. His current orders were peculiar. He was to deploy to north to Lake Ontario, where the war had long since ended, to investigate the potential mutiny. Apparently, the former militia officer was encouraging the soldiers and Minutemen to the desert and mass the site of the abandoned fort. It was rumored that some of the British soldiers had joined them. Upon arriving in the nearby town, they gained contacts. One Daniel Saxon, previously thought to have been killed in the battle. Now is a self-styled preacher and prophet. He claimed to have received those divine visions foreshadowing the imminence of the end world, and was urging troops to abandon the war in preparation. He was said to be baptizing people in the lake of anticipation of an expected next stage. Silver Lieutenant Major Bowers had predictable suggestion. March right up to the fort, bayonets fixed, in an overwhelming shadow of force. He was though showing his knavery prior to becoming a soldier. The major had ever in his life met a person, talked to an Indian or known as a Catholic. Of course, people preparing for the end of the world set him alarm. For his own part, Silver had some dealings with these frontier revivalists and knew that they were odd but about most part harmless. He had a better plan. Send his spies in to see what Daniel Saxon was all about. 2 soldiers were sent, pretending they have deserted. They have stayed long enough with the Secretarians for 4 days before sneaking out of the camp at night. When they reported back, they had a wild story. This prophet was highly energetic man, delivering his apocalyptic message to the memorizing speeches that betwitched in those attendants. Even though 2 spies were enfrailed, the assembly would erupt into spontaneous outbursts of foot-stomping, shouting, or yelling, what sounded like gibberish, and the 2 men could scarce resist joining in. It was like when he had the spell all over them. During mealtimes, there was a bizarre form of anticipatory prayer in which people would interject at all, and afterwards they would sometimes break into small groups or silent meditation until one would receive the revelation and share it. For Colonel Silver, there were things that he heard before, but Major Bowers, the officers, they have ported the revolution. The colonel decides to speak for Saxon himself. He arrived at the fort one Saturday. The Rangers hold hiding about in the woods in case of emergency. The once small clearing on the fort had been widened to make room for the pilgrims. Colonel had passed a number of tree stumps when he walked up the path to the site. Up on the wooden tower he saw a man who presumed to be Saxon, preaching the town to the assembly below. Over the chest-high wooden wall he could see people, mostly men, but there were few women and children as well, packed like little messages around the tower, some having to cook from the house on the wall where there were tents and sleeping sacks. Some wore their army and military uniforms, including a couple red-wearing jackets. There was at least one Indian there as well, and some other people. For his own part, his men, assumed to be Saxon, wore a black lab. The man in the tower wrapped up his preaching just as Silver reached out to bare entryway to the fort. Despite the small size of the fort, the colonel had trouble making his way through the constraints to Saxon. He reached for him at the bottom of the tower, but now he was sitting on the tent. Whatever was said between the colonel and the Renegade Milita captain would never be known, for something caused Rangers hiding in the autumn foliage at the open fire at that point, shooting over the low wall. They felled a number of these gathered, and then it was as one of the few who were armed fired back. Second volley was poured about upon them. A third was discharged at the mass of those attempting to flee. The Ranger Bappeton, as well as outnumbered Saxon's little mission, so whatever it was their intention or not, they killed almost everyone in the fort, including Saxon and Silver. The Rangers took Silver's body and buried it on the shore of the lake, and then interned for the rest of the dead in the mass grave, along with the newly cleared path to the fort. Finally, they burned the fort and the wooden tower to the ground. Within the generation of this place would become just a footnote and a failed prophecy. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties. And as always, stay pretty.